Okay, welcome, Eric. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you. It's been long anticipated event as far as I'm concerned. Thank you for agreeing to join this conversation, and it's privilege for me personally to sort of have time and interact with yourself. Um, I hugely respect all your work, and I think it's very beneficial to people who are interested in apologetics, people like myself, people who are still learning, and thank you for all you do. Um, okay, so it would be great maybe if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, just so we know who you are.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be able to talk to you from across the pond, as they say. Yeah, my name is Eric Hernandez. I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses doing Trinity events at churches or seminars, teaching others how to engage culture via apologetics and evangelism, and doing what three annual what we call the unapologetic evangelism conferences, and that has been just a real treat and blessing to be able to do that and support my family and be able to eat off of doing something like that. So God has been good.
Brilliant. So, as you probably know, I am subscribed to all your channels on your YouTube channel and Facebook, and am a great fan of your work. But if other people want to try and find you and subscribe to your Facebook page and YouTube page, where can they find you?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. They can just type in youtube.com/ Eric Hernandez, and they can find my YouTube channel there where I post most, if not all, of my debates and other interviews that I've done, some commentary videos, or just responding to other things that have happened or objections that have been raised against certain topics or issues regarding God, consciousness, or the soul, and things of that nature.
Brilliant. Now, the next question I wanted to ask you is actually reading some of your posts, because we've been Facebook friends for a couple of years now. There was a moment where I came across a young gentleman who I think might have passed away, who gave really glowing review of what you have done. Sort of, you took him under your wings and trained him, and went to lots of other things. And obviously, there's been a positive influence on your part on his life. Uh, but I was wondering what got yourself into apologetics, what got you interested, and why did you choose this particular path?
Yeah, great question. So I would, and the young man you're mentioning, Daniel Romero. Yeah, he was someone who just um, wanted to just kind of travel with me and just wanted me to take him under my wing. In fact, it was around this time, just to give you some backstory to what you brought up. My wife and I had just gotten married, and I was not yet with Texas Baptist, so at the time, I was working two or three jobs, and then juggling now a family. And he had reached out to me because we had met previously I spoke at the high school he attended. And he basically asked if, pretty much, hey, can we meet? I'd like some guidance and this and that. Now, admittedly, at this point in my life, I have had other people reach out and ask me that, but oftentimes I either wouldn't take it seriously, or they'd cancel last minute, or lots of other factors that you can imagine. So now that I having a family and juggling jobs, I thought in my mind, to be honest, I thought, here's another guy, young guy, who's just gonna ask me for this, but not follow through, not really take it seriously. So at the time, I would wake up about 4 a.m. and I would head to the gym to work out, because again, just with being so pressed for time, I decided to do my workouts in the morning. So thinking to myself that this guy wasn't going to be serious about this, I said, "Look, I'm really busy this week, but I'll tell you what. If you really want to meet with me, I'll be at the gym at about 4:30 in the morning. And if you're as serious as you say you are, I'll see you there." And I remember looking to my wife and saying he's not going to show up. Well, about 4:15 rolls around and I'm still on my way there, and he texts me saying, "Hey, I'm here at the door. Where are you at?" And I was just like, "Wow, this guy this guy must be serious." And uh, long story short, I mean, it was just some of the things he shared with me, how he had been treated by some people, by Christians in his church, just this pseudo spiritual um, mindset that they had and kind of pressed on him. For example, he said, "I feel called to maybe, be an athlete or do this or that, but they're telling me that's not of God. That's my own desires of my flesh. But I think God is calling me to this." And so, I mean, a lot of genuine questions, but you can tell he was kind of confused by some things. So, after we had this conversation at the gym, he pretty much said, "Hey, do you think we can do this again?" I said, "Sure. I'm here Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays." And he said, "I know you speak a lot." He goes, "Can I travel with you? Can I help you? Can I hold your stuff or help you out?" And I was just really impressed and moved by that. And he had traveled with me for about 5 or 6 years before he passed at 24. But what I love about what we do and the truth of what we believe, because it's more than just a belief. It's not something that we. I'm not a Christian because it makes me a better person or a better father. It does that, but at the end of the day, I'm a Christian because it's true. Um, Knowing that, as I've heard it said, death is not a purity; it's just a comma. And knowing where he's at, I was it gave me great comfort and hope in that. So to your question about how I got into apologetics, so my freshman year of college, I got a full ride scholarship to go to community college through cheerleading, which is a whole nother story. But they basically said, "We'll pay for your books and tuition if you throw girls in the air." So I said, "Sure, let's do it." Um, as I was signing up to take some electives, I had to fill some electives with, some classes. And I thought, well, let me pick a class that I could probably skip that would be kind of easy. It's my freshman year, first semester. And I saw this class in philosophy, and I thought, I think I'll do that because in my mind, philosophy was just giving your opinion on something, and I was good at making stuff up. So I thought I could probably skip this class a few times. Well, first week of class, my professor says this week we're gonna learn about something called the burden of proof. And the reason this was important and that stood out to me, because if you were to rewind so many months prior to this class, I remember one of my youth pastors saying that if anyone asked you to prove to them that God existed, all you had to do was to tell them, "Well, prove to me he doesn't." And I thought, well, that's brilliant. I'm going to put it in my back pocket and use it when I need it. Back to the class. My professor said, we're going to talk about what's called the burden of proof, which is basically the notion that if you make a claim to truth, you then bear the burden to prove or demonstrate the very thing that you claim is true. And then he said, as a random example, which I later found out was probably not a random example because he was an atheist, he said, if you're a Christian here today and you claim that God exists, then you now bear the burden of proof to show that he does exist. But if you tell the person asking you this question, "Prove to me he doesn't," you're going to commit the fallacy of shifting the burden of proof, because if you make the claim, you bear the burden. And when he said that, I felt like my house of cards just kind of collapsed. I felt like, well, there goes that. But I was really intrigued because I learned a lot. I was allowed to ask questions, which was a contrast to a few instances from some of my youth pastors who would tell me, at least on two instances, told me to stop asking questions, essentially. Um, so I was, needless to say, I was hooked. I was really just intrigued by this discipline. So the second semester rolls around, and I wanted to take another class in philosophy. And every one of my peers warned me that if I was going to take another class, not to take Professor Pena's class, because if I took his class, then I could lose my faith because he was very condescending and antagonistic towards Christians. Well, this kind of excited me, not because I wanted to lose my faith, but because I knew in my mind that if Christianity was true, I needed to know why. Now, I didn't know what apologetics was just yet. I was just dipping my toes in the waters of philosophy, but I knew enough to know that if Christianity is true, I need to know why. But I also knew that if it wasn't true, I'd still like to know why. And perhaps this is the guy for the job. So here was the pivotal moment and day in class that really shifted what I wanted to do or where I was going and put me on the path that I am now. He walks into class and he takes his seat at the front at his desk, as he usually did when he would lecture. And then he pretended to pull out this antidepressant pill from his pocket. And he said, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And according to Christianity, it's the thing that can give us hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away. He says, but according to Christianity, your soul is something that's not physical. It's some immaterial thing that has your emotions and your moods and your thoughts and your feelings. And these are supposed to be immaterial. But he points to the pill and says, but if I were to take this pill, which is a physical, how is it that an antidepressant pill could have the power to change and affect the alleged immaterial states and moods of my soul? Because when we look at the brain, all we see are neurons firing. And when we look at the body, we just see these base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But no scientist has ever looked under a microscope or at the brain and found the soul. How do we explain this? And basically, he said, well, it's simple. I'll tell you how. It's because there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there's no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body. And we need to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. And after so many words, it was pretty much like, well, class dismissed. Um, as a freshman in college, I was stunned. I was shocked. I was bothered by it, quite frankly, because up until that point, I had heard a lot of complaints against Christianity, but they didn't amount to objections or refutations. For example, someone would say, well, I'm not a Christian, or I don't believe in God because Christians are hypocrites, or churches just want you for your money, or the Old Testament, this and that. But even if all those accusations were true, it wouldn't mean that God didn't exist or that Christianity was false. However, I knew that Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15 that if there is no resurrection, then he's basically saying Christianity is false. However, I also knew that if there's no soul, well, I would argue there can be no resurrection, and by the same token, Christianity would be false. So here, for the first time in my life, I heard an objection that, if true, would in fact mean that Christianity was false. And I had two options essentially. I could just sweep it under the rug and not think about it, or I can roll up my sleeves and get my hands dirty with some metaphysics. And given my character and personality, I did the latter. Needless to say, I later, as I learned more philosophy, I later learned what apologetics was. I found the work of great men like William Lane Craig, and then found the work of someone like J.P. Moreland, who is my favorite philosopher. And I saw that he did and specialized in work on the soul. In other words, I wasn't the first one to have to wrestle with this stuff, which was very comforting in and of itself. And to know that there were people who had devoted their lives and have done scholarly academic work and published on these issues, I was like a kid at a candy shop. I just couldn't get enough of it. Interestingly, 5 years after I graduated from that community college, to keep the story brief, that professor ended up being my first opponent in a public one-on-one debate on the existence of God, which was really interesting. Sometime after that debate, I had approached him and I said, I know you're an atheist, so I don't know how you're going to take this, but I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life. Because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be where I'm at now. And one last thing I'll say, that although it's funny to me, it's also sad, because when I look back on my life and see how I got to where I am and the people that motivated or pushed me in this direction, I can't say that I got into apologetics because I was inspired or encouraged by some Christian or pastor or minister. In fact, that was the opposite at times. But rather, I was put on this path and got into apologetics because of two atheist philosophy professors. Because quite frankly, even if God wanted to use a Christian to influence me in this way, he couldn't, because there were none in my life who did. There's a verse that says, where Christ said that if you don't let them cry out, or if they don't cry out to me, these rocks will cry out. In my life, those two philosophy professors were the rocks that God used to cry out, because there were no other voices crying in that way. And I'm extremely grateful. And it's one of the reasons I'm a Molinist, because I believe that God knows exactly what to do and where to put us to accomplish his will and goal.
Great, that's fantastic. Excellent testimony. I think if we had more of those, I think for me personally, they work wonderful even as an argument for God. That's my personal opinion. Um, and I just want to say that, you know, how you structure your arguments are really fantastic. They work really well. There's so much content in them, and one of the first arguments I heard from yourself was actually argument for soul. And I wanted to kind of continue that, if that's okay with yourself. In particular, the existence of soul and how this could be used as an argument for the existence of God. So if you don't mind, that would be my next question.
Yeah, absolutely. So quite a few things to say here, because typically, when if I'm doing a debate, and I want to focus on the soul, typically these are debates concerning just that topic: does the soul exist? But to your question, how can this be used as an argument for God? Is a great question, because it takes another step and further explanation as to why it's relevant. Because, for example, I've had atheists say, well, you know, I can be an atheist and believe in something like free will, or I can be an atheist and believe in something like a soul, which I would say are not, uh, uh, um, cannot be accounted for in an atheistic worldview. But my response is always, well, there's a difference between believing something as an atheist and believing something that is logically consistent within an atheist worldview. Those are two different questions. Now, a few years ago, I was in the process of writing a book, which I've put on the back burner, and I've actually am in the process of writing a different one for work that they've asked me to write, kind of like a beginner's guide, if you will, on witnessing to non-believers. But in the first book I mentioned, I was laying out an approach that basically goes as follows, to try and keep it brief. Um, in philosophy, there's a field known as epistemology, which is a study of knowledge and beliefs. And what we know from there is that sometimes beliefs logically imply other beliefs. So we can say that sometimes belief A will imply belief B. Now, in order to be consistent, if you're going to believe A, and if A implies B, then you're going to have to believe both A and B, because B was a belief that was entailed or came from A. So here's an example. If I have, let's take A as a base belief, and this base belief is all dogs are mammals, or rather, all dogs are brown. Let's do that one. All dogs are brown. Well, if all dogs are brown, then that would imply a belief that the next dog I meet is going to be brown. However, if the next dog I meet is, let's say, gray or black, well, that has just disproven my belief B, that the next dog I'll meet will be brown, is false. And given that belief B came from A, it must follow that that base belief A was false as well. Now, when you get a number of these, they're called epistemic chains. Sometimes A implies B to C and so forth. But the same rule applies, in that if a base belief somewhere down the chain implies a false belief, then that base belief, the belief that was entailed by that, was false as well. Now, with this in mind, when you look at the atheist worldview, I would say that the base belief is that there is no God. Setting definitions aside, I usually just say, if there is no God, what would that imply? Well, let's look at it this way. If there is no God, then the only way we can explain our existence is through Darwinian evolution via natural selection. which means there is no need for any supernatural immaterial entities to come into existence. Paul Churchland said, given the evolutionary account of our history, there is neither need nor room to fit any immaterial, non-physical substance or properties. Okay, so I would say if you're going to be an atheist, the most logically consistent position would be naturalism. Now, when you apply this naturalistic perspective to human beings, then you're going to get something like physicalism, which is a view that human beings are purely physical objects composed of physical properties and parts. So, that being said, if I can disprove, if you will, physicalism, then that would go back to disproving the beliefs that were implied from it all the way to atheism. Now, here's the interesting thing is that in logic, you have something like the law of excluded middle, which is a view that something is either true or false. It's either or. So if belief A is false, then its negation must be true. So you have A and then you have not A. If A is false, then not A is true. So if atheism is false, the belief there is no God, then not atheism is true, which is there is a God. So if you can show that an implication from the atheist worldview is false, then atheism would be false. And obviously, if atheism is false, then God must exist. Okay. That being said, as a quick foundation, I would say there's lots of ways to show that physicalism isn't true or that naturalism isn't true, atheism isn't true. So when I give a case for the soul, I take a two-point approach, if you will. My first basic point is to demonstrate that consciousness is not physical. And then my second point is to argue that I am more than a brain and body, which leads to that I am a soul. Now, let me explain why, first of all. Um, the reason it's those 2 points is one, when we look at consciousness, we're essentially going to be looking at the states and properties of consciousness. And we know that when properties show up in the world, now what are properties? Those would be things like blueness or triangularity, those types of words, roundness, redness. When these properties show up in the world, they don't show up floating in the air by themselves, but rather states and properties are always going to be exemplified and grounded or possessed by something more basic than themselves. So, for example, when I'm driving on the freeway, I'm not cautious to avoid hitting the property of redness, but rather I'm cautious to avoid hitting an object that possesses the property of redness, such as a car. Now, once we establish that consciousness exists and we have these states and properties, then we have to ask the question, what is it that possesses these conscious states and properties? And of course, I can say, well, without any doubt, I know at least one thing is conscious, and that's me. I am conscious. But then the question is, what am I? And then that's where we go to, well, you have physicalism and something like substance dualism. I'm either purely physical or some type of dualistic perspective is true. Okay. Now, before I move on, any questions or comments on that? That was just a foundation so far.
Yes, brilliant. I mean, the only comments I could say is thank you very much for going into details. It's absolutely fantastic. I think that helps me understand some of those more complex ideas. So I'm hugely appreciative. As I told you before, I tend to take notes because, try and memorize them. So definitely benefit. I am benefiting from all your work. So I have one question. I was watching Larry King a few years back before he died, and one of the reasons why he said he sort of decided there was no God, he had some kind of operation or something like that, and he was put under, as you usually do before the operation is performed, and he said he doesn't remember anything, and therefore there is no soul, or something to that effect. I have heard other people obviously use arguments for or against the existence of soul and so on, using sort of the basic argument of physicalism, saying that it's just a material chemical reaction within the brain that tells us, where we are, who we are, and what we should be doing, and so on. And I was wondering how you would address some of those, because that is kind of an argument that would stump most Christians. They would sort of struggle, or certainly I would struggle to find really good answer to those.
Yeah, so great question. So this brings us right back into, in other words, I can answer this by going into the approach I had laid out. So there's two basic points. One, consciousness is not physical, and two, I am more than a brain and body. Now, if we can even go back to what my professor was saying, I can put it like this. If what my professor was saying is true, then what he is purporting is that given the fact that something physical can affect my brain, which in turn will affect my mind, then it must follow that my mind is nothing more than, that is to say, it is reducible or identical to something physical like a brain. Now, in philosophy, when we use the word identical, we mean literally the same thing as. So if I say A is identical to B, I'm not saying it's similar, but rather it is literally the same thing. So Eric Hernandez, we can say, is identical to the guest on your show. Now, that doesn't mean I'm similar to the guest on your show, but rather literally I am the guest on your show, and we're just using two different titles to refer to the same person. Now, there was a law known as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, but let's just call it Leibniz's law for short, which states that if two things in question are the same, that is identical, then whatever is true of one is going to be necessarily true of the other, and vice versa. But what's interesting is this also gives us a rule of thumb to note that if we can find something true of one thing that is not true of the other, then it follows that by default, they cannot be the same thing, because if they were, they would share the same properties. Okay, so here's the illustration I like to use. I would say that if, so suppose you walk into a lab and you see two bottles of clear fluid, and you want to ask yourself the question, are these two substances the same substance? Well, as you look at them, you notice that they both are liquids, and they both have the properties of being clear fluids. So you think, well, thus far, I would say that perhaps they are identical. Now you see that one has the label water and the other has a label chemical X, but you can't really read it too well because it's ripped off. But then you turn over the bottle that's labeled chemical X and you read on the back, it says caution, flammable. And you think, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know they cannot be the same thing. Okay. So with this in mind, if what my professor was saying is true, and if the physicalist account of human nature is true, then consciousness, if it exists, is going to have to be reducible or identical to something physical like the brain. And again, this is where some arguments come in where people say, well, look, if you have brain damage or Alzheimer's, it's going to affect the way you think. And they conclude, therefore, the two are the same thing. But again, the only way to establish whether or not something is or is not identical is Leibniz's law of identity. Now, let's take the states of my mind and compare it to the states of my brain. My mind can come in 5 states. You have thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will. So let's take a state like my thoughts and beliefs. The state of my thoughts and beliefs can have the property of being true or false. But when I look at the neurons that are correlated with my thoughts, as I look at those set of neurons fire, while it may make sense to say that my thought is true or false, it makes no sense to say that these group of neurons firing are true or false. So automatically we see that they share different properties, and given in Leibniz's law of identity, they cannot be the same thing. A second example would be that my brain can be in a state which weighs 3 pounds. And my thought that I'm talking to you right now, while we may be having heavy thoughts, they don't weigh 3 pounds. So while this may get complicated to some, we're not going to go buy a neck brace after this is over with, because my thoughts aren't weighing 3 pounds. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is a sensation, and it's a state of my mind, well, smells of roses and the taste of banana is not 7 inches long. And while I can give a dozen more examples and various other arguments, it nevertheless follows that if the properties of my brain are physical, and if the properties of my mind are not physical, then it follows that consciousness, if it exists, cannot be identical or reducible to something physical because they don't share the same properties. Now, at this point, the physicalist or the atheist would have to do one or two things. One, have to offer a response to this problem of identity, which I've never heard a good one, or they are going to have to altogether give up the existence of consciousness and qualia, which I have seen and know of atheists that do in fact do that. I'm thinking of someone like Daniel Dennett. But ironically, if you give up consciousness, then you're essentially going to have to say that you don't believe that beliefs exist. But the moment that you have a belief that there are no beliefs, well, then you've now just proven your own view false because you have a belief that there are no beliefs, which is itself a belief. So I would argue one of the ways you can argue for God in what I would call a backdoor approach to apologetics is I could simply state that if atheism is true, then given physicalism, consciousness would not exist. However, I am consciously aware of this argument, therefore consciousness exists, therefore atheism can't be true.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, I heard this argument before, and I just wanted to sort of check where you stand on this particular issue. I know that even some evangelicals have some reservations or have sort of variations of these arguments on the existence of soul. But one of those is called Christian mortalism, basically, which suggests that when you die, your soul is not aware of anything. It's like, as in the old days, people used to call it a soul sleep or something along those lines. I was wondering where you stand and why you hold to that particular view.
And before I answer that, you can remind me later if you want. I didn't touch yet on and I just remember this myself, about the cause and effect relationship and how that doesn't explain identity, but I can set that aside and we can, if someone else wants to ask, it can later. I'm just making it.
Sorry. If that is really important, it would be
sure.
very good if you do.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay,
ignore my question.
No. It's a good question. It's just as you were talking, it just came to my mind. So usually when I present what I just did, usually people already kind of get, okay, then yeah, consciousness can't be physical. But then there are still some people who say, well, okay, but how does that relate specifically to what your professor said? And initially, I'm basically showing that what my professor said can't be true because of this. But that may not necessarily for some people answer, okay, then how do we explain, or how are we to view this cause and effect or relationship dependency? And one thing I would say is, first and foremost, it's important to make a distinction and show that a cause and dependence relationship is not the same thing as identity. Here's what I mean by that. As I've already stated, identity means that two things in question share the same properties because they're using two different titles to refer to the same thing. Whereas a cause and dependence relationship automatically assumes and implicitly concedes that there are two things in question. So, for example, suppose that you have the world's greatest guitar player. We know that in order for him to convey his talent and music, he needs a properly working guitar. Now, if one or two of his guitar strings were to pop, then let's say that he could no longer play the song he wants to play, which means we have just established a cause and effect relationship and a dependency on the guitarist's ability to play the music and a properly functioning guitar. But just because we've established a cause and effect or dependence relationship, it doesn't follow from this that therefore a guitarist is just a guitar, even though we've showed a cause and effect relationship. Or what about when people say, well, doesn't it prove that your thoughts or beliefs or memories are in your brain? Well, no. Why not? Because in the using the same analogy, if I were to detune a guitar or pop a few more strings, let's suppose the guitarist was no longer able to play the note C. Again, a cause and effect and dependence relationship has been established, but no one, because of this, no one goes to a guitar and cracks it open and expects to find the note C to fall out of it. Because even though there's a relation there, it doesn't mean it's the same thing, nor does it mean that these notes of music are inside of a guitar. When I play the note C on a piano, I don't open up the lid and look for it, because again, cause and effect does not establish identity. So much like a musician and his guitar has these dependent or causal relations, much like that doesn't prove that they're the same thing. In the same way, showing that getting brain damage or Alzheimer's affects my mental states, and damage can affect other states and properties of my mind, it doesn't follow they're the same thing any more than a broken guitar establishes that a musician is a guitar, because as I said earlier, cause and effect is not the same thing as identity, nor is it sufficient to establish that two things are identical. In fact, again, cause and effect and dependence automatically implies two things are not the same thing. So it cannot be used as an argument to show that consciousness is physical. Again, just to reiterate, causing something doesn't show that it is nothing but the thing that is caused. It in fact has to be two different things.
Yeah, that's really helpful explanation, actually. Thank you for that. I mean, I've always held this view that as I'm sort of getting older, you can't tell that when you look at me, but I am. I've never felt that I am changed as such. I mean, my body is not able to do things that I used to be able to do before. But in essence, I feel that I am one and the same that I was when I was 5 years old. To me, I like your saying that you are not body with the soul, you're soul with the body. I don't know if you have anything else that you
Yeah,
could.
yeah. So that goes into the second point, that I am more than a brain and body, and this is where I get into a little bit more definitions. And I would say that, so now that we know that we have established that consciousness is not physical, and we that in fact consciousness does exist, because to deny it exists is to incorporate and affirm it. So as I said earlier, if these things exist, what possesses them? Well, I do. Well, what am I? And this is where I begin to defend more specifically what is known as substance dualism. In brief, substance dualism, a generic substance dualism, is a view that I am a soul that has a body, meaning I don't, quote, have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and a soul without a body is nothing more than a corpse. But then I do have to clarify that up until a couple years ago, I did change my position on this, because I do now believe that I have a soul, and it is an orange Kia Soul, which is parked in my driveway. And I bought that car just so I can make this joke, and it's worth every penny. You could say it's a very rich joke, if you will, and it drives the punchline here. Okay, so that aside, so I am a soul with a body, uh, which means I am not reducible or identical to a brain and body, same as before. Now, how do we show this? Well, there's various ways. I usually use three arguments: indivisibility of personhood, identity through change, and free will. But I can kind of sum it up in various ways, and let me just show one. Um, if if I am identical to a brain and body, then it would make sense to say that if you were to chop off my arms and limbs, that you would now have 50% of a person. So this goes into the question of what is a person, and more pertinently, is being a person, the property of being a person, is that a property that can change in degrees and be quantified in various percentages? And I would say no, because if you were to chop off my arms and legs, you could say that I have 50% of a body, but it would make no sense to say that I am now 50% of a person, which means if my body can be cut to 50%, but I remain a 100% person, well, then it follows that I am not identical nor reducible to my brain and body. The identity through change can be summed up by simply saying that I like how atheist philosopher Jaegwon Kim put it in one of his books, as he was expressing and conveying these arguments. He used one that I liked, where he said, basically, it's alleged every 7 to 10 years that you change virtually every cell in your body. And he said in 2001, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2001. Therefore, I am not this brain and body. Um, then you have the argument from free will. And again, just to keep it brief, if we are purely physical objects, we know that purely physical objects don't act on their own, but instead are caused to act by external and prior factors and causes. Now, someone might say, yeah, but we're conscious. Okay, well, all that does is add an extra step. If I made a Coke machine conscious, it doesn't make it any less determined. In other words, I don't put $1 into a Coke machine and find that it chooses to sing me a song instead of give me a Coke. It's predetermined and programmed to operate on the basis of inputs and outputs. Now, if we are nothing but purely physical objects, then you can't have free will. You're just causally determined by external factors beyond your control. So it would follow that if I did have free will, or better yet, to even have the sheer possibility of free will, I would need to be something more than a brain and body that transcends the physical determinations of my brain and body and is able to act as a first mover and bring about changes and events in the real world. So I would say, given that we do have free will, then it follows that I am not a purely physical object. I am a soul. Now, some people would may argue that, okay, well, time out though. I don't believe in free will. To which I would respond by pointing out two things. If there's no free will, there's no more responsibility, and there's no rational responsibility, or what I've called intellectual integrity. This is because, for example, suppose someone is murdered with by being shot. Although it was the bullet that actually penetrated the heart and took the person's life, we don't blame the bullet. Why? Because we assume the bullet was caused to fire by the gun. So now let's look at the gun. But still, we don't blame the gun. Why? Because we know that the gun didn't fire on its own, but was caused to fire by something else. So then we keep going back, and what we eventually do is we arrest the person because we intuitively know that the person was the first mover in this causal sequential chain of events. However, if there is no soul and then there is no free will, then much like the gun or bullet, if we cannot hold the gun or bullet responsible for the murder because they were merely secondary intermediate causes, then it would follow that we could also not hold the person accountable, because if there is no free will and physicalism is true, then much like the gun or bullet, the person was also an intermediate secondary mover and thus not the first mover in the causal chain of events. So more responsibility goes out the window. When it comes to rational responsibility or intellectual integrity, this one I've always found kind of funny, because a lot of atheists that I know want to call themselves free thinkers. And by that, they mean that they are free from the shackles of religion and they are not brainwashed and they can think for themselves. And yet in the next breath, tell me that they don't believe free will exists. To which, of course, I ask, and did you freely come to believe that? And I've had atheists tell me, yes, I freely came to believe that I don't have free will. The irony, of course, is that if there is no free will, then you could never take intellectual credit for any of your beliefs, which means that ironically, some not all, but some atheists will in a patronizing way look down on believers and other Christians and think that they are intellectually superior to them. But like I said, ironically, if there is no free will, then the reason for you becoming an atheist is no more rational than the reason for which you have this religious nut yelling on the street corner, holding a sign saying the end is near. Both of you were determined to come to those beliefs, and neither one of you can take intellectual credit for your beliefs any more than you can take credit for the color of your eyes or the color of your hair. So if there is no soul and there's no free will, then you could never claim moral or rational responsibility for the truth of your beliefs, nor could you verify the truth of your beliefs. And I think this is important too. Suppose I believe A, B, and C, and someone says, well, Eric, you believe in determinism. So how do you know A, B, and C are true if you were just caused to believe it? And usually atheists will say, well, I can test my beliefs. And I say, oh, well, how would you do that? And, well, I would run this scientific experiment and I would verify with other people. And then I would come to the conclusion that my beliefs that are determined are either true or false. And I say, well, wait a minute. If all your beliefs are causally determined and beyond your control, then would it not be the case that the conclusion you come to about the belief about your beliefs, would that not equally be causally determined and beyond your control, and thus you've only pushed back the goalposts? In other words, you cannot claim that your beliefs are true based on a belief that you are determined to believe that your beliefs are true, because you're back to the same problem. So again, no more responsibility, no rational responsibility, and no intellectual integrity. Which means if the non-believer does want to affirm rational responsibility, if they do want to take intellectual credit, and if they do believe people are more responsible, well, then free will exists. And if free will exists, the soul must exist. And I would argue if the soul exists, God must exist, because you cannot have such a thing on a naturalistic framework. So if free will exists, soul exists, God exists, atheism is not true.
Wonderful. I was wondering whether we have time, because I was going to ask you another question.
Sure.
So the existence of soul, it's for me, it's a fantastic argument. It's brilliant in a sense that it makes people think. It's very personable, personal. It's very easy to accept because it sort of makes intuitively great deal of sense. It certainly does to myself. But I wanted to talk to you regarding sort of Christianity in particular. And one of the biggest arguments for Christianity, as far as I'm concerned, is the resurrection of Jesus. I'm not sure how much time you have. Are we still okay to
Yeah, go for it. Sure.
Yeah, okay. So often people say, so we know there is God. You've helped us come to that conclusion. Thank you very much for that. But how do we know that actually Christianity is the right religion, that Jesus is God of the Bible or part of the Trinity? And how do we know that this should be where we invest our belief and faith? And sort of looking at the resurrection of Jesus, there are lots of objections that we hear from atheists. For example, things like, well, the original story was not probably like that. There was some additions. As you go through time, more and more things are added, made to sound a little bit more marvelous. And actually, the body of Jesus might have been stolen, or Jesus didn't die on a cross, as some Muslims would claim, or the women went on to visit a wrong tomb during Easter Sunday, all that sort of stuff. So I was just wondering if you had something that you could share with us that could be used. And again, I could be taking up notes and using in the future.
Yeah, a few things. I'd say first, great books. Michael Lincona and Gary Habermas co-wrote a book on the resurrection. Lincona has a really thick, I don't know if I have it here with me, it may be in another room, really thick book on the resurrection. And Gary Habermas, and these are two of literally the world's leading scholars in the resurrection. Gary Habermas is in the process of writing his final project on the resurrection, and I believe last I heard he was up to over 5,000 pages or something like that. So, so needless to say, there has been a lot of ink spilled in defense of the resurrection, and great work has been done. So, a few things I would say. for those who may not be familiar with the case for the resurrection, there's various approaches, but essentially, what you're going to do is present some key historical facts. And I'm giving you the really rundown nutshell version, and basically say, here are historical facts. What is the best explanation for them? And we look at the various competing hypotheses and see which one checks off the list, if you will, of all the criteria needed for a good historical explanation. You have things like explanatory scope. Does it explain all the facts that we can have a relatively high degree of confidence that these facts are historically accurate? And then, is this hypothesis, does it cause us to unnecessarily believe things that wouldn't fit the time? Like if I believe that someone 100 years ago had a CD player, or something like that, well, now I have to believe in something like either time travel, or that this person had this technology. In other words, I have to come up with beliefs for which I have no basis for, other than trying to save my hypothesis. Okay, now various people have offered a number of facts. I know you can. There's something as little as 12, and then even as little as 3. There's no necessary perfect number or amount. It's just whatever a person feels comfortable with, that we can say again has a high degree of historical confidence that these things in fact did happen. My light went out there. Let me fix that really quick. It's going to bug me. Okay, um, three that I've used, that I like to use, would be something like an empty tomb, or the fact that he was crucified, the post-mortem appearances, Christ appearing to people after they died, and the origin of the Christian faith. How the reason for which it spread. Now, at this point, if you're talking to someone, they can do one or two things. They can either provide a hypothesis to try and, well, I guess three things can be done here. They can provide a hypothesis to what best explains these facts, or you can show how the resurrection explains these facts, or they can uh, object to the the very principle that these are indeed historically documented facts, that we can have a high degree of confidence that these happened. If that latter occurs, and you can show how historians, what criteria or rules of thumb they use to look at something and see whether or not this thing is in fact historically reliable. And you have things like the criteria of embarrassment, um, which is basically that if I'm going to write something or make something up about myself, or even if I don't make it up, I am going to want to portray myself in the best light possible. Meaning, if I say something that would hurt my character or testimony, then chances are that's going to be true, because there is no reason for which I would make that up. Of course, all things being equal. So, like, let's say if being a minister working with Texas Baptists, if I were to one day say, you know what, guys, I don't believe in God anymore. Well, if I said that, that would be a big loss, or a big blow, if you will, to everything I've done in the past. Meaning, if I were to one day say that, chances are I'm not making it up for fun. It's probably because I really believe or mean it. Enemy attestation, same thing. If I'm writing a book about myself, then you would expect me to say great things about me. Like, that's expected. However, if one of my enemies, let's say some atheist I've debated that just doesn't like me, if he said, you know what, I can't stand Eric Hernandez, he's annoying, he smirks too much, he's too sarcastic, but you know what, hey, he dresses nice. Well, then, given that an enemy of mine, so to speak, is saying something positive about me, then we can say chances are that is historically reliable, because there is no reason for someone who is opposed to you to say something positive, meaning that if they do, we can take it to the bank. This is good history. Okay. Now, what you were asking or talking about was the other thing I mentioned, and that was people proposing hypothesis to try and explain the facts, because quite frankly, these are historical facts that cry out for an explanation. And I think the sheer fact that there are competing explanations shows that indeed we have to somehow explain these facts. And how can we do this without God? At least that's what the secular community would have to do. Now, let's take something like you mentioned. The body was stolen, I think, is one thing you mentioned. Okay, well, let's say the body was stolen. Would that explain all the facts? Well, the three I mentioned were the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and then the origin of the Christian faith. It would explain the empty tomb. Like, okay, it explained, like, if, in other words, if we grant someone stole the body, then we can say, in all fairness, sure, that would explain the empty tomb. But what about the post-mortem appearances? An empty tomb wouldn't automatically entail that there are postmortem appearances. Now, someone can say, okay, but okay, they hallucinated because they were grieving, because they missed their savior, et cetera, which would be historically inaccurate. That wouldn't even be something that, put it this way, back then, if you had a Messiah that you would follow, but he died, then you would just go get another Messiah. You wouldn't mourn him and try to keep following him after death. In other words, this has happened before, prior to Jesus, but when that Messiah that they followed died, well, then you'd go find a new one. Also, people who are strongly devoted to these alleged messiahs or teachers or rabbis, after they died, they would have a yearly celebration at their tomb to honor them. We find no record of the disciples doing this for Jesus. Now, we know that they sincerely followed him. Then why wouldn't they do this at his tomb every year? Well, perhaps because they believed he wasn't dead anymore. He had risen. Um, okay, so it doesn't explain the post-mortem appearances. And then even if I were to grant, is what I was getting at, even if I were to grant, okay, his disciples missed him and they had these hallucinations, which is not even, it's anachronistic to begin with historically. But let's go with that. Well, now not only do you have to deal with those, but now you also have to deal with the fact that enemies of Jesus claim to have seen him. Skeptics claim to have seen him. Paul, who would kill Christians, he didn't feel guilty about this. He actually said he saw himself as blameless. Um, he became a Christian. And if you were to ask him why, he says, well, because the risen Lord appeared to me. Same thing with James, the brother of Jesus. His brothers initially called him crazy. They didn't believe him. And then later, now you have James following Christ, even to the point of being persecuted. Okay, so it doesn't explain postmortem appearances. And then you have the origin of the Christian faith. In other words, why did it spread? Well, it spread because of what the second point, they truly believed they saw a physically risen Lord. Now, if the tomb was empty, stolen body explains it. Doesn't explain the postmortem appearances, but then even again, the origin and spread of the Christian faith. They were willing to die for their faith, and many of them did. Um, Now, someone might say, yeah, but Eric, I mean, people die for their beliefs all the time. And they'll point to the terrorist attacks on 9/11 at New York and the Twin Towers. And they'll say these Muslims died for what they believe, but you don't use that as evidence for Islam. And I would say they're correct. I don't. But here's the difference. It's one thing to make up a belief or a lie and convince someone else, and that person dies for what they believe to be true. But it's another thing altogether for me to die for something that I know is not true and that I know that I've made up. In other words, the apostles were in the very rare position to know for a fact whether or not Christianity was true and based on a resurrection or false and based on a lie. As it's been said, liars don't make good martyrs. So if they were lying, they would have been the ones to show that, wait a minute, time out. Yeah, hey, just joking, guys. I made it up. But they didn't. We have no evidence that they did. We do have evidence of some of them that did go to their death because of this. Now, some people would say, well, not all of them. Well, sure, but one, that doesn't mean they didn't. All that means is that we don't have sufficient historical evidence to show that they did. For example, I have a brother who lives about 7 hours from where I live in Texas, and someone could tell me, "Hey, yesterday your brother went to the store and bought a gallon of milk." Now, if I were to go to his house right now and I don't see the gallon of milk, does it mean that he didn't buy it? No. Perhaps he bought it for someone else. Perhaps he dropped it on the way, to his car and it burst. Point is, something can be historically true even if we don't have the sufficient evidence to say with a relatively high degree of confidence that it happened. So, that being said, a charitable person would say, okay, we do have evidence for these apostles who died as martyrs. For these other ones, we have a few maybe implicit documents, but we're not sure. But hey, all is fair. So again, when you look at any other hypothesis someone is going to give you, you're going to see a few things. Either it doesn't explain all the facts, or if it does explain all the facts, well, now we have something that's messing with one of the criteria, such as now you're having to make up beliefs that weren't established. So if someone says, well, an alien stole his body, well, not only do you now have to show how an alien stole his body, now you have to show that aliens exist and how you know they exist. Now someone might say, but aren't you doing that with God? And to some extent I would say, sure, yeah. If God does exist, then that's exactly, the resurrection would be the best explanation. Someone say, well, now you have to prove God exists. Again, I'm fine with that, but the resurrection in itself, I think, is evidence for the existence of God. And if God does exist, and obviously we both believe he does, and he can create the entire cosmos out of nothing, then as I've heard it said, raising someone from the dead is child's play. It's not a big feat for him. And if someone wants to say, well, hold on, though, we know through science that dead people stay dead, I would say, yeah, they naturally speaking, a dead person will stay dead. But the argument is not that he naturally rose from the dead. The argument is that in a supernatural, miraculous way, rose from the dead. So it's like saying, hey, when baseballs fall from the sky, they keep falling. And I say, but I have one in my hand that I caught. And they say, no, 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 no. Baseballs, naturally speaking, when they fall, they hit the ground. Well, sure, naturally speaking, without any intervention, they hit the ground. But if I, as a first mover, can step in and intervene, I can overpower the law of gravity. In the same way, if I can do that as a human being that is not omnipotent by any means, well, then surely a God who created the very laws of nature himself could step in, intervene, and over the power of the natural laws and bring about a miracle, which is in part the definition of what it means to be a miracle.
I definitely agree with that. I think that, again, makes good sense to me. Now, I watched a couple of videos by a person you debated several times, I believe, Matt Dillahunty, I think. And his argument was that you cannot trust personal testimonies of other people. You can't base your faith on that. I think mostly that comes from his personal experiences. He certainly used to be a magician, and he thinks that people are easily tricked. What is your response to that? And again, I think one of his comments was that he's not a historian, and therefore it doesn't do anything for him. I mean, for me, it makes sense, everything that you said, but I'm just wondering if you have sort of a brief response that could be used in some of the arguments that we encounter.
Yeah. So Matt is an interesting guy. I've met him a few times. When we see each other, we act just like friends. I don't. I would say we're friends in a loose sense, but it's not like I talk to him on a continual basis. But every time I see him, it's a hug. How you doing? How you been? And catching up. But Matt, it would be more appropriately described as what you would call a skeptic. Now, being a skeptic is not merely someone who is skeptical about something, but rather it's an epistemic position, for lack of a better word, that someone takes when assessing any truth claim. And there's ranges of skeptics, but basically, and to oversimplify, admittedly, basically, if I'm going to be a skeptic, then whatever you tell me, I'm going to raise the possibility of doubt. And once that's done, I've accomplished my job. I dust my hands and say, I don't know. Well, that's a little bit too fast, too loose. So to what you said, he may say something like, "Well, you can't trust, a person's testimony or something like that." Well, surely he doesn't believe that. Surely he believes the testimony of many of his friends. If his best friend or person he's dating says, "Hey, I'm going to the store," well, he can trust that. Now there may be there may be room for doubt, but room for doubt doesn't necessarily mean you don't trust, or that you don't have a confidence in someone. Uh, on top of that, everything that we do is in some sense based on someone else's expertise or authority. When I step into my car and drive it, when I step into an airplane, I am in some sense trusting someone else's skill and ability to do something. And what I find interesting about skeptics is they're usually what you would call a local skeptic. Contrast that with the global skeptic. A global skeptic will say we cannot have knowledge in any area of inquiry at all whatsoever. A local skeptic would say we can have knowledge in general, perhaps, or maybe not even that. I don't know if Dillahunty would concede that much, but they'll say we can have generally trustworthy beliefs in many areas, but when it comes to this area here, I'm going to turn my skeptical dial really, really high. And you notice this in various implicit hinted ways. So, for example, again, I'm sure Dillahunty wakes up and he turns on the light, trusting that it's going to come on. He gets in his car, trusting it's going to work. If the mailman says, "Hey, there's a package coming for you tomorrow," I'm pretty sure he believes that. He trusts another person's testimony. But when it comes to these questions, now his skeptical dial's turned way up. Uh, and even on top of that, I would say, and this is where we would disagree, I would say beliefs are innocent till proven guilty. Meaning, if I believe something, all things being equal, I could have a basic belief that unless I have reasons to disbelieve it, then I'm virtually justified in believing the thing that I have in my mind. Now, granted, this doesn't necessarily mean that I can't doubt a belief. It just means I don't have sufficient reasons that would justify disbelieving or doubting my belief. So, for example, someone could ask me, "Do I believe the sun will rise tomorrow?" I'll say yes. And then they'll say, "Well, is it possible that it won't rise?" I'll say, "Sure." And they say, "Oh, so you don't believe it's going to rise?" "No, I do believe it. But you just said it's possible it wouldn't." "Right. Go on." Okay. In other words, for the skeptic, there's this high view of certainty that I think is unfounded, interestingly enough and ironically, in that many times skeptics will often believe that certainty is a requirement for knowledge, but it's quite simply not. I don't need certainty to have knowledge. In fact, I would even say that in some sense it's irrelevant, because whether or not I'm certain about something doesn't validate or invalidate the truth of the thing I'm claiming to knowing. Moreover, certainty is a property of my conscious conviction, not a property of the truth or falsity of a statement. I can be certainly right or certainly wrong, and either way, certainty doesn't do anything for it. But for the skeptic, if you don't have certainty, you can have knowledge. So I think there is a big misstep in the whole skeptical epistemic approach to begin with. So with this high degree of certainty, with the skeptical dial raised up, I think most of the objections, or I wouldn't even call them objections, most of the complaints someone like Dillahunty may have towards these things are not really objections, they're just complaints. And merely raising the possibility of doubt doesn't do anything to invalidate or validate the truth or falsity of a claim. I've had skeptics tell me, isn't it possible you could be wrong? And I say, yes. And for them, they're like, well, there you go. And I say, well, hold on, time out. Is it possible I could be right? Yes. Well, then there you go. It cuts both ways, doesn't it? And so here's a useful thing. A useful tip, if you will, I can add. Whenever you're approached by skeptics, such as someone like Dillahunter, who would take this approach, I noticed that some of the things you said, were exactly something like a skeptic would say, in that they're merely positing hypothetical possibilities, or that, well, we don't know if it's changed. Well, we don't know if this or that. Well, we don't know X, Y, or Z. In other words, they're just their goal is to raise the potential of doubt or something being wrong as much as possible. And after so many words, you think, well, maybe there's a case there, but no, raising a bunch of potentials doesn't make any of them actual. So here's an example. I was talking with someone one time, and they said something like, well, is it possible that talking about God, was it possible that this, that, and the other is true? And I said, yeah, I mean, it's possible. And I said, but here's this, that, and the other. And then, okay, but what about, is it possible that, and after a few times, I just had to stop and say, you keep asking me this kind of question, but let me say it, let me reverse it and say it this way. Do you have any reason to believe I'm wrong? And they'll say, well, yeah, because it's possible that this could happen. And I would say, okay, yes, it is possible that could happen, but do you have any reason to believe that it will? Well, no, but it's possible. Well, sure, it's possible. But unless you give me a reason to think that it's not only possible, but probable, well, then all you're giving me are hypotheticals, which are a dime a dozen. That does nothing for me. So merely raising the possibility isn't sufficient. And when someone says, so if someone tries to say, well, this is possible, you can say, well, what reasons do you have to believe that it's not only possible, but actual or probable? Is it possible that we're in the matrix? Sure. Well, then how do you know we're not? Well, because you haven't given me any reasons to think I am. What's possible? That's a reason. It's also possible that I'm not. That's a reason too. So again, if we're gonna, in order to play chess, we have to move the pieces. We can't just keep slapping the pieces off the board, which is kind of what many skeptics do. So I would say don't fall into the trap or bait of being certain of certainty. Don't fall into the vicious cycle of how do you know, isn't it possible? Because those aren't objections. They're just hypothetical pushbacks that do nothing. And we don't have to have this. And one last thing is, especially with people like Dillahunty, they pose or frame the discussion or debate in terms of something like, you need to convince me to win this debate or discussion. Oftentimes, someone like Dillahunty, his responses would be, well, I'm not convinced by that. And I've talked to a lot of other people who've debated him, and I've kind of helped prepare. They debated him. People like Michael Jones. I remember talking to Lincona one time when he was preparing to debate Dillahunty, and I said he's gonna do this. He's gonna say he's not convinced about something. If and when he does that, don't bite that bait and run with it. Just point out that that's not, like, who cares? That's not the debate topic. In other words, the debate topic is, does God exist, or does the soul exist? The debate topic is not, can I convince Matt Dillahunty that God exists, or can I convince Matt Dillahunty the soul exists? Because if you allow the skeptic, to frame the debate in that way, well, of course you're going to lose, because at the end of the day, all he has to do is say, not convinced, and he wins. Which is kind of a shady tactic in my opinion. But when you know how to spot these implicit tactics, whether intentionally disingenuous or not, they're nonetheless tactics that totally veer off in the wrong way and get away from the heart of the discussion.
Yep, that's really, really good and really helpful. I think I'm going to have to remember those arguments. They certainly come up from time to time. Two things that I wanted to say, what I in particular like about your style. You mentioned chess earlier, and I like how you tend to anticipate. It's like a chess player where you go ahead maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 5 steps ahead, and you think where they could potentially go, and you seem to address those even in your original sort of statements, which really, really appeals to me. It just shows me that you have run through the arguments from both ends, which I think it's really good. And also, in a way, you deliver them. I like that sense of sort of a genuine interest in people, and yet at the same time being quite how should I say this? Not necessarily polite, but kind of firm in where you stand in your faith, because it's well reasoned argument that you're putting forward, and it's not just an argument; it also is part of your personal faith. So I was wondering, have you got any particular advice for people who are looking to start building, looking to analyze some of the existing arguments and so on? What they could potentially do to develop their arguments if they want to try and evangelize other people and use apologetics as a means for evangelism?
Yeah, great question. I would say a few things. Before answering the question, maybe some advice to anyone who's looking to engage and incorporate apologetics into their evangelism. And one of the first things I would say is keep the main thing the main thing. Um, for example, I've had when talk with lots of things, and to thank you for the compliment. What I was going to say, which is happening now, is that having ADHD helps a lot to remember these things and connect these things. It's a blessing and a curse. So I can't take credit for it all on my own. Surely I did develop the gifts God gave me, but I also think that ADHD was, in some sense, something that helped me to develop and unpack this stuff. It can also cause me to get on my wife's nerves, but like I said, it's a blessing and a curse. Um, Keeping the main thing the main thing. Uh, when when I'm talking to someone, or if someone calls themselves an atheist, the definition of an atheist is a person who believes that God does not exist. That is the classical traditional definition. So when someone says I'm an atheist, the first thing I do is to ask the question, what reasons do you have for believing that God does not exist? In other words, the burden of proof is not something that only applies to the Christian. It's something that applies to anyone making a truth claim. So if someone makes a truth claim, you have every right to press their feet to the fire and have them bear the burden of proof. So if an atheist will say something like, "Oh, all the arguments for God are rubbish," I say, "Prove it." And they say, "Well, no, they're rubbish. Prove it. You just made a truth claim. Prove it." Or they'll say there is no God doesn't exist. Prove it. Well, I believe there's no God because there's no evidence. No. Rewind. You said that God does not exist. You have to prove that. And you can't say that my lack of evidence proves there is no God. Because it's another thing some people say, well, there's no evidence. I say, well, how does that prove there's no God? I have no evidence right now that my brother in Texas, 7 hours south of Texas, I have no evidence that he went to the store yesterday. But does it mean that therefore he didn't go to the store? No, of course not. So if you're going to make a truth claim, you either prove it, and if you can't prove it, take back the statement, please. I'm not arguing, I'm not debating, I'm just having them adequately bear the burden of proof. So I'll say, what reason do you have for not believing in God? Remember, keep the main thing the main thing. Some will say, well, because the Bible's full of errors. And I say, well, I disagree, but let's suppose that's true. How would a Bible full of errors prove there's no God? And they might say, what do you mean? And I say, okay, well, follow me here. If let's suppose the Christian God did exist, did he exist prior to the Bible being written? And they might say, but I don't believe in God. I say, no, I understand that, but follow me here. If the Christian God did exist, would he have existed prior to the Bible being written? And they say, well, yeah, if he existed. Okay, good. Which means that if he did exist, and if he existed prior to the Bible being written, then how does an alleged Bible full of contradictions all of a sudden make him cease to exist if he does? Well, obviously it doesn't. Again, so far I haven't given arguments. I haven't presented a case. I'm just asking them, Why do you believe what you do? Just as they would ask us. It's a fair question. And if they give responses that are not directly answering the question, I point it out in a respectful, loving way. Okay. Okay. Now, that being said, keep the main thing, because at the end of the day, we're saved by and through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which means two things have to be true for Christianity to be true. God exists, obviously, as a prerequisite, and Jesus was raised from the dead. He was the took on the punishment for our sins. So if I have 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a taxi car ride with a non-believer and atheist, I'm not going to talk about the age of the earth. I'm not going to talk about evolution and creation. I'm not going to talk about whether or not the Bible is inerrant or reliable. While all of those topics may have their place and have some importance and relevance to certain doctrines within Christianity, neither are sufficient to establish the opportunity for salvation. And as I've always told people, everyone is going to go into the afterlife with false beliefs. So we might as well help them get into heaven with false beliefs than go to hell with false beliefs. So don't bother with the peripheral, non-central issues. You don't want to, like Willem and Craig says, you don't want to make the bar so high for people to cross and become, believers and followers of Christ. You want to make it as low as biblically possible, of course. That way there's no stumbling blocks unnecessarily put before them before they give their lives to Christ. Okay, now the next piece of advice, if you're going to present things, I would say don't try and, I'll put it the easiest way I know how. Don't jump into a public online debate if you've only read one book or two, and or if you've only barely familiarized yourself with the arguments. In other words, I've seen people who have either done public debates or tried to talk to someone using an argument maybe they just heard or they're barely familiar with. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but here's what I'm getting at. They will start to use the appropriate philosophical language and metaphysical terminology, but they really don't know what it means. But they've heard William Lane Craig say it enough that they'll start saying it. And they act as if by reading a script, and this is not a script, but by reading a script, the non-believer is going to fall to their knees and give their life to Christ. But of course, that doesn't happen in real life. What usually happens is they'll say, wait, say that again. Something is metaphysically necessary. What does that mean? And they're like, well, that wasn't in the script, so I don't know. I thought you knew what it meant. That's why I said it. I don't know, and then they end up doing more harm than good. So I would say don't use, at least not publicly in this way, arguments or terminology you're not familiar with, which goes to say that whatever you do plan on using or engaging, incorporating into evangelism, be sure that you understand it. Don't just parrot someone else. Now, of course, that would require you going and studying the very thing that you want to use. Now, I'm not saying don't practice. When I first started learning, I would try, sometimes I would just read something. And for me, at least, and again, having ADHD, it helps me to interact with someone and because maybe they can pose objections I haven't thought of. So you can think of these as like sparring matches, not official debates or, going out in the street and witnessing to somebody. Although, again, I have no problem with that. But I would say, okay, I just learned this argument and I would pose it to someone and they would raise an objection. When I first learned the Kalam years ago, I remember sharing this and someone said, yeah, but not everything that comes into existence has a cause. You just think that because you see things come into existence that have causes, and they'll use an analogy like, let's say, a sheep is, has a mother, but a whole flock of sheep don't have a mother. So even though the individual things in it have causes, the thing as a whole doesn't have a cause, i.e. a mother. And I'm like, that's interesting. That's weird. Never heard that. Something sounds off about it, but hey, I appreciate that. Now that I got what I need, talk to you later. I'm going to go research this. In other words, I wasn't trying to pose as some Willem Lynn Craig personality type. I was genuinely trying these things out. And of course, first of all, no, I don't believe everything that begins has a cause, because I see it in nature. It's a metaphysical principle. That's not something, it's an a priori belief that is not something I derive from looking at. It's something that's, I would say, is a metaphysical necessity. And yes, the whole flock of sheep don't have a mother, but each individual sheep did have a mother. And you can say that the flock did begin at some point in time, maybe after 2 or 3 sheep were born. Nevertheless, my point is you become familiar with these to where you're not parroting these arguments. You are genuinely learning and explaining them, even better if you can do so in your own words, because 99 times out of 10, they are going to press you on terminology or points. And if you're just parroting what someone else said, you're not going to be able to answer that. So when you're doing that, whatever it is, just be sure you understand it. Don't be pretentious. Be humble. Don't try to make something up. Just learn how to interact, learn how to present, and know what you're saying when you do.
Yeah, I really like that advice. I've worked on projects for probably more than 20 years in my secular work, and we have saying, KISS, I'm sure that's the same everywhere: keep it simple, stupid, and using it in plain English. I think that's really key, because often people get confused, and if you can explain it in simple terms, it just really shows that you truly understand what you're talking about. So I think that's a fantastic advice.
Yeah, I would even say practice explaining it to others. To be honest, most of the non-believers I talk to, I don't have to get into the deep metaphysical issues, not because I'm not familiar with it. Now, granted, let me rephrase that, because I don't want to sound pretentious. I'm not saying I understand all the metaphysical intrinsic inner and outward workings of something like the soul, but I think I can say that I do have a fair grasp of it. But what I'm getting at is I don't have to explain the intricate details regarding the metaphysics of a substance and ontology and how these things relate in logical priority and things of that nature, the relation of part to wholes and aggregates. I can explain it in simple terms, and depending on who I'm talking to, I can get as deep as I need to go. But again, it's only because I have understood it. Now, I'm not saying you have to go get a degree in this stuff before you can use it. I don't. But I'm saying understand it enough to where you're comfortable not only presenting it, but getting some feedback and pushback from it. And a great way to do this is to explain it to someone. Explain it, pretend you were explaining it to your grandmother or to your 12-year-old brother or sister, whatever the case is. And even try to do this with an adult, and then say, hey, was that clear? And they'll say, what did you mean by this? Or I don't know what you meant by this. Because especially if you've done this for some time, the words will become so familiar to you that you'll forget what it felt like when you first learned them. So if I go up to someone and say, hey, what do you think are the metaphysically necessary attributes when it comes to the essence of human nature? Someone's gonna, I mean, what did you say? Now I understand what I said because I'm familiarized myself with this, but others won't. So when you talk to someone else who's not weird like us or hasn't studied this stuff as much as us, it will show you how to better communicate. Also, I would advise that when you're studying a position, don't just study what you believe to be true. I encourage you, study what the other people have said and know how to respond to them. And that doesn't mean you have to read the entire book by someone. You can read excerpts of the relevant chapters. I've picked up Sam Harris's book on free will, and I've read relevant chapters. I've looked into Dennett's work and read some of his stuff. John Sorrell has some interesting takes on the soul and whatnot, and I've at least familiarized myself enough to where I could tell you roughly what they believe. And not only do you want to know both sides, you want to make sure that your opponent has done this as well. And here's why. And here's why this is very, in my opinion, very useful. I learned this from hearing Moreland, and I've incorporated this myself in a debate I had with Tom Jump. He said something like, there are no good arguments for the soul. They're all ridiculous. I'm paraphrasing. And as I've learned before, don't let someone get away with saying something like that. So I said, oh, okay, well, given that you've studied this stuff, or you say this with such confidence, I can only imagine you've studied it. So you take out your pen and you give it a loud little click, and you say, what are the can you give me the top 3 arguments that you think are the best ones out there, and can you give me your responses to them, please? And he said something like, oh, well, I don't remember, it was so long ago. I said, oh, okay. All right, fair enough. Well, how about, well, surely you've written, I mean, you've read books on this, as confident as you are. Can you give me the top maybe 2 or 3 books on this topic from either side, physicalist or dualist, whatever? Oh, you can't. Oh, huh. And he says something like, well, I don't think I've read a book. I think I've seen some videos. Oh, okay, interesting. Well, okay, sure. Hey, fine. Okay, how about this? Can you give me the top 3 scholars that have written on this subject, and why you disagree, and what their positions are, and if you can, why you disagree with them? I don't know if I know of any scholars who do it, because it's all ridiculous. No, okay, hold on. It's fine that you say that, but if you can't name scholars, you can't name books, and you can't name arguments, and yet you're so confident that there are no good arguments or evidence for it, I'm beginning to wonder how seriously I should take you right now. Because if you ask me, what are the top books written on the subject, I can name them. Who are the top people? I can name them. What are the top arguments for and against? I can name them. I'm not bragging. I'm saying that if I'm going to stand up and be so adamant and confident about something, I'm going to be sure to do my homework. And I'm going to be darn sure that I'm going to hold the other person to that same standard. Because if you're going to confidently deny something, you better have some evidence to back it up. Because mere confidence and dismissing something isn't going to work for me.
Yeah, actually, I was going to check this with you. Something that's been irritating me for a really long time. And I know a couple of Christians who are close friends, they get irritated with me because I get irritated with this sort of argument put forward. It's agnostic atheist. I think it's kind of redefining the meaning, and people like to use that as a way of saying, I don't need to prove anything. I just lack a belief in anything, and it's your responsibility as a Christian to prove it to me that basically God exists. Now, I was wondering, what is your response? Again, I'm just looking at the time. I've taken an awful lot of your time. I don't
No,
know
that's all right.
if
No, that's
you,
fine.
yeah,
Yeah, we can address this one.
okay.
So yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, depending on how many prayers I've said that day, or what I've had to drink that day, depends on how I will answer. But needless to say, it's such a ridiculous notion. I mean, it is just it is. I roll my eyes every time just about I hear something like that, because you have there are 3 main positions essentially. Because I would say skepticism isn't a position; it's more like an epistemic approach or method. But you have the theist who believes God does exist. The atheist, traditionally classically defined as someone who believes God does not exist, and the agnostic who holds no belief one way or the other. Um, one thing I've learned to do is when someone kind of tries to switch around these definitions, like, okay, look, forget about the titles, and I write down, I believe God exists. I believe God does not exist. I don't believe one way or the other. And I say, and I write them down. I say, can you please circle which one applies to you? Um, in other words, no, set aside the definitions. Just as simple as that. Which circle the one that applies to you? And they might say, well, I'm an atheist agnostic. I said, those definitions aren't here. Just circle the one that applies to you. That's all I want. And we can call yourself what you want. In other words, while I think it can be relevant to discuss definitions, at the end of the day, I don't care what you call yourself. I want to know what you believe. Now, that's probably the main thing I would do. And I would say, look, if that's fine, if you want to call yourself that, but just know that when I say the word atheist, this is what I mean by it. Just so we can be on the same page. You can disagree with the definition, but I'm just letting you know what I mean. And sometimes I'll just either not use the title, or I will clarify every time I use it. Like I'll say, so that means if atheism is true, that is the belief there's no God. In other words, I'm just clarifying that. The but if we're gonna, I guess to kind of get into the weeds of this. So all these three positions revolve around beliefs. There's a lot of objections I've heard to why people call themselves atheist agnostics, but quite frankly, an atheist believes there is no God. An agnostic holds no belief one way or the other. So it makes no sense to say that I don't believe God exists and I don't hold a position one way or the other. That's a contradiction. Now, oftentimes, there's a number of things they'll do, but they'll say something like, well, agnostic means without knowledge. So I don't believe God exists, but I'm not saying I know there's no God. And I say, no, let's stop playing that game. And maybe they're not playing a game. Maybe they truly believe this, which is just that's they're misinformed. I'll put it that way. Because basically, yes, if you look at the etymology of agnostic, it is without knowledge, just like an atheist is theist, without theist, God. Um, but if we're going to go strict etymology, then an atheist isn't someone who believes there's no God. It's just a person that is without God. So that would be really odd to say, I believe God exists, but I'm an atheist. Well, that's a bit confusing. In the same way, the agnostic isn't necessarily saying, I don't know there's no God. It's still a belief because, again, if we're going to be strict etymology, agnostic is without knowledge, which would mean agnosticism isn't even a question of God or no God. It's a question of knowledge or no knowledge. So if you're going to be agnostic, are you telling me you don't have any knowledge at all? No, of course not. In other words, it means something. Moreover, agnosticism, we could say agnosticism is not so much saying I don't know if God exists, but rather I don't have sufficient knowledge to come to a belief on whether or not God exists. It's still about belief. So, theist, I believe God exists. Atheist, I believe God does not exist. Agnostic, I don't have sufficient knowledge to make a belief one way or the other. So, yeah, when they try to combine those, they're really just confusing and conflating etymologies, definitions, and word games, which is why at the end of the day I say, call yourself what you want. If there is no God, here's what follows, and it's simply that. I try not to quarrel too much over definitions because, again, atheism, schmatheism, call it what you want. We're looking at truth, not necessarily at what you believe or don't believe or claim to know. Let's just look at what are the facts of reality.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. Um, so before I take any more of your time, I have just one more question that I would like to
Please.
ask. And it's basically this. If I wanted to go and learn more on, say, certain subjects, particularly apologetics, where could I go, or maybe good books that you would recommend, material that I could look up, anything like that that could help us expand our knowledge and learn more?
Are you familiar with the book Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview?
No, sorry.
Let me grab it. Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview is my jam, as we say here in the States. This is the first edition written by my two favorite philosophers and theologians, Moreland and Craig. In fact, again, this is the first edition. I think it got in 2012, signed by both of them. Shameless name drop there. And this is the updated edition. Does have some extra stuff and content, but this for me is like the Bible of philosophy and apologetics, if you for Christian philosophy and apologetics. It covers all the major fields of philosophy relevant to theology and Christianity, and provides almost an exhaustive, if not a surface level exhaustive view of various positions within certain relevant fields and disciplines. And I have read some of these chapters many times over. And if you would, I mean, if you even where it's like falling apart, and if you even looked at, I mean, I just also taking notes like crazy, especially in some areas that like on substance dualism, soul, stuff like that. Lots of great stuff in here that I would highly recommend. There are some chapters I haven't read, and I've owned this book for maybe 8 years now. One, I don't like to read. That's also in part because of my ADHD, but it's also because I've read other chapters over and over, or have gone back to glean from certain things, and then the updated edition came out, so then I'm rereading some other chapters and seeing what's added and whatnot. And some chapters I'm not particularly interested in, and I'm like, I'll get to that later, and I just have never gone around to it. But anything from science, epistemology, metaphysics, ontology, relations, and I don't mean relations like platonic or marital. I mean like metaphysical relations, like greater than and lesser than, to the right of. Those are relational properties. Um, so yeah, I would say that would be, in my opinion, one of the best books you can get. It's not beginner, but it's also technically not graduate level advanced PhD. It's somewhere in the middle. If anything, maybe leaning more towards the advanced, only because there's a lot of new terminology to learn. But once you're familiar with the terminology, it becomes easier. Now, I would tell people, don't be discouraged if you read something and don't understand all of it. I've heard Moreland say, if you can read something and understand about 15% of it, then you're doing pretty good. If you can understand 30% of it, you're doing really good. But his point is, don't expect to pick up something new and understand all of it. Read it the first time through, and if you get 10, 15%, that's great. You can go back and read it again later. I haven't read a lot of books in my life, but but the books I have read or listened to, because I prefer audiobook, I've listened to a few times. I'm in fact going through another one of my favorite books is Loving God with All Your Mind by J.P. Moreland. That book is, it convicted me, encouraged me, strengthened me, uh, 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 broke me. I mean, it's so many great things. But I'm actually going through that one again for I don't know how manyth time I've gone through it. But I just find that every year, every so many few years, I learn and grow, as we all should. So when I go back and reread something or listen to something, you have to keep in mind that, especially these two guys, but in general, academics and scholars, they're careful with their words. So they're not going to just throw around a word arbitrarily for the fun of it or word it. They do it for a specific reason, which is something I learned in some sense the hard way when I first got into this. When I tell people don't get up there and just spout something that you're not familiar with, I'm not saying that as a chastisement. I'm speaking from experience. And I learned that when Craig or Moreland say something like, therefore, necessarily, he's not just using words to fill in the gaps of the sentences. Necessarily is a technical term in metaphysics that basically means it's impossible for this not to be the case, right? So he's not adding emphasis of like, this is really, really true. He's meaning something particular by it. So when I go back and read books I've read, or go back and chapters I've read in studies, I find that I'm understanding them and able to grasp them in a far much deeper and better way. So yeah, that this book is definitely one I would recommend. Loving God with All Your Mind by Moreland. Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, along with Stealing from God. I think those are good beginner level books. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. And I don't say beginner as a derogatory term. I think even Frank would say that as well. I'm just saying, depending on where you're at, I would say this is the best bet, my favorite. Something a more beginner level would be one of Turek's book I mentioned. And then the other stuff, the deeper level stuff, which I probably shouldn't even known myself, but you have like Blackwell's Companion to Substance Dualism. That one is it's heavy. I don't mean in a literal sense, but I mean the terminology there gets far deeper than this stuff, and it's fun to read. But even I'm having to sometimes just stop and make sure I understand the words they're using, so I can understand the context of what they're saying. But it's fun for me, at least.
Yes, yes, definitely agree. I think I own a couple of books by J.P. Morland, and you're right. I have to read the same chapter 5 times before it actually start fully to, well, not fully, as you say, 15% of that to start sinking in. But I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah,
Clearly,
and to be fair too, or maybe to clarify, when I say I go back and read them, I don't mean like although I do go back and read sometimes, but it's not always to understand. Sometimes, again, having ADHD, sometimes I'll go through a couple pages and I'm like, what did I just read? I wasn't paying attention, and I have to go back and do that. That can be really frustrating because I even with audio sometimes I kid you not, my drive to work is about 30 minutes. And from the time I got in my car to the time I got home in those 30 minutes, I had only listened to about 3 to 5 minutes of an audio podcast because I kept replaying it over and over. It was a long day because I wasn't paying attention to what I was saying. But I even if I don't understand something, I will push through and just keep reading until I've reached the end. And then if needed, I'll go back and because sometimes later on what's said kind of elaborates or unpacks better what was previously mentioned or said. So I try to take it all in at once. And then sometimes I'll take it all in. I'll put the book down for a few months, maybe a couple years, then I'll come back to it and try it again. And that's what I mean in going back and rereading chapters or passages or books.
brilliant. Um, I would just like to sort of thank you for all your time and all your effort. It's been absolute privilege, and I'd like to ask you one more thing. I'm doing Columbo now, aren't I? Um, um, we both believe this is a spiritual sort of warfare that we are involved with, and I was going to ask you, would you mind sort of concluding this session in prayer, and particularly praying for people that like to get involved in apologetics and who would benefit from sessions like this, uh, if that's okay.
Absolutely. I would love to. Yeah, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you, Lord, for just who you are and what you're doing. I thank you, Lord, that you've given us this technology to be able to communicate in this way. And I pray, Lord, for those listening, for those that will listen, for those that are listening to this after it's been recorded. I pray, Lord, that you would speak to their hearts and minds, Father. I pray that you would bring about a healthy sense of conviction to their consciousness, in that we don't do this simply because it makes us happy, because quite frankly for many it doesn't, as you know, but we do this because it's true. And I pray that you would give believers around the world a conviction for standing up and presenting who you are and the work of Christ as something that is true and knowable. I pray you would raise up leaders all across the world, Lord, in the States, in the UK, and that, Father, that we would just have such a hunger and desire for you that we would want to reach any and everyone we could. I pray for understanding. I pray for wisdom. I pray for discernment. And I pray that your spirit would guide them, Lord, in what they study and what they read and what they seek out, Lord, to look into and begin to just really dive into some of this material, Father. I pray that you would call people, Lord, that you would make them uncomfortable in a healthy way to the point that they would want to learn more and know more about you, Father. And in doing so, even perhaps taking up the mantle of an apologetic ministry and just making a difference for your kingdom. I thank you, Lord, for my brother David. I thank you that you've put this desire in his heart. I thank you that you've placed him in my life. I thank you that he is a brother in Christ that I can co-labor with. And I thank you for his passion, Father, and his recognition that these kind of things are needed in our culture and day and age, Father. And I ask that you would bless him, his family, that you would continue to mold and shape him, that you would sharpen his mind, sharpen his discernment, and help him bring to remembrance the things that he's learned over the years, and help him connect the dots in much deeper and profound ways, Lord, all for your kingdom and for your glory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen, indeed. It's, again, great privilege. And I just want to thank you for all the work that you put in and tirelessly work with people across the globe. It's beneficial to myself. And I've been trying to study this subject for years, and I'm clearly still learning, still novice. Just big thank you.
The honor and pleasure is mine. I am still learning myself. Sometimes people say you're smart, and I say no. I just make stuff up, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, then I can make up whatever I want, and you wouldn't know the difference. But no, it is. I tell people we are one body and many members. For whatever reason, sometimes some believers will try to object to what I do between us. Sometimes I think it's either intimidation or an excuse as to why they haven't done apologetics. But regardless of the reason, I tell people, look, being an apologist, it doesn't mean I'm better than you or less than you. I tell them just look at it as a different member of the body. In fact, I'm an evangelist, and I consider myself in some sense a missionary, because when you think of missionaries, we typically think of someone we send to a part of the world that we cannot reach. And as I was talking to one business Christian entrepreneur who was, won't go into the story, but was kind of, how can I say this in a Christian nice way, who was kind of being condescending and patronizing to what I did. I said, look, in a few weeks, I'm going to go on this atheist radio show for 3 hours. When he asks you X, Y, and Z, what would you say? And he pretty much said, I don't know. And he says, well, I guess I wouldn't go on there. I said, right, but I will. So you can, whether you support me or not, I'm going because it's a place that you cannot go. And that's fine. You know, we're one body, many members. You may be a hand, I may be a foot. I smell sometimes. That's okay. But we can work together and help each other out. Iron sharpens iron, and we are here to encourage and work together. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for equipping the body of Christ. So hugely grateful.